On this episode, we're talking about equity in the world language classroom. Though on this podcast we talk specifically about the world language classroom, the idea of equity is really universal to all of education and every single classroom. I'm joined by AC Quintero, who is a very accomplished Spanish teacher, writer, and speaker on equity and social justice in the classroom. Let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively? If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I'm Joshua Cabral. Today, we are going to be talking about equity. The concept, the idea of social justice and equity is so front and center on our minds right now, as it absolutely should be. It is something that should have always been there, but we have opportunities to make this more of a focus right now. So, what does equity in the classroom mean? How do we go about it? What does it mean when we talk about assessments or culturally responsive teaching? To help us grasp this concept and to truly understand what it means, I am joined today by AC Quintero. AC Quintero is a Spanish teacher in Chicago, and you probably recognize her name because, in addition to being an incredible teacher and mentor to so many students and teachers, she is also an author of CI Readers that help students not just their language skills, but to understand the concept of culture and other cultures around her. So thank you so much for joining us today, AC.
Well, you're welcome. And I am just so honored to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction.
I would really appreciate if you could kind of round out the story for us, make it a little more robust so that we understand who AC Quintero is.
Well, so I am currently teaching high school. I teach at a college prep school. But I started my career teaching middle school. So I was an IB teacher for a long time. And I really like to credit the IB program with just sort of broadening my lens in terms of like how to teach, the importance of like culture, the importance of like really honoring students and everything that they bring to the table. And I actually started my career as a writer
Mm-hmm.
a little over, I want to say about 4 years ago. So I've always been a storyteller since high school, and I have told this story countless times. My friends would always come to me for a story, and these were like real life stories. I would just
Mm-hmm.
tell them about like things that just like things that happened to me after school, or if I had gone on a date with someone. And for some reason, like funny things just always happen to me,
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there, during high school, I kind of sort of developed the knack for just like telling stories.
Mm-hmm.
And once I became a teacher and sort of honed that art of storytelling, and just in addition to learning about like CI novels and seeing like a lot of different stories and different characters sort of depicted in those novels, I decided to I wanted to sort of broaden the types of stories that were being told.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually kind of how I got started. I didn't really see a lot of Black characters in books, or if
Mm-hmm.
I did see those characters, I always felt like their storylines were sort of truncated. It was just
Mm-hmm.
about like maybe racism or like oppression,
Mm-hmm.
and always sort of tied to like a social justice lens.
Mm-hmm.
If I did see stories with characters of color, and so that's kind of how I got started. I
Mm-hmm.
really wanted to sort of provide students with kind of like books of joy, I
Mm-hmm.
like to say, stories about kids of color, people of color, just doing everyday things,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's how I got started. And it's kind of been nonstop since
Mm-hmm.
then.
Yeah, I particularly appreciate that lens on providing stories of joy, as you said, and it's not just the sadness and troubles that come up in those
Yes.
stories. That particularly happens with LGBT stories. It's the sad coming out story. It's not the kind of well-adjusted happy with their life person, and if all of the stories are only about the struggle experience, which has its place clearly, but
Yes, I agree
also
wholeheartedly.
moving towards the once you've navigated that, where can you end up?
Well, I just wanted to piggyback off of that, and I think that I think you bring up a really important point. And when we talk about like mirrors and windows, and we talk about these types of stories in the class, I always think about, what we're putting in front of our students, and if that's all we're putting in front of our students, then we are really limiting these different groups of people,
Hmm.
and so it is really important just to have stories that just talk about life,
Hmm.
like talk about life of a person that like happens to be LGBTQ, talk about
Hmm.
the life of a kid that happens to be Black and lives in
Hmm.
Chicago.
Hmm.
I think those are very important, and those are the types of stories that I grew up with, and I think
Hmm.
that's probably why that's part of my reason for sort of starting this Odyssey, because I just remember like, man, if that's all I read growing up
Hmm.
as a kid,
Hmm.
it's pretty depressing.
Right.
Like,
Hmm.
I mean, again, they have their place, but we really need to sort of broaden the horizon for our
Hmm.
students.
So let's get into this conversation about equity in our world language classrooms. And the first thing I would like to hear your thoughts on is this idea of what students bring to the classroom. Before we even jump into equity and figuring it out, like what do we as teachers need to understand about what our students arrive with?
That first of all, that's a really good question. And I
Hmm.
think that that is a good jumping off point. When I think of skills that students bring to the classroom, I think of sort of like this continuum of learning, right? Where you have your dependent learners and you have everything in between until you get to your independent learners. And so when I think about the dependent learners, those are the students who really depend on maybe the teachers or maybe other kind of expert students carrying that cognitive load.
Hmm.
And then your independent learners, these are students that have kind of learned, they depend temporarily, let's say, on teachers maybe shouldering some of that cognitive load, but then they also are developing an approach to learning. So I
Hmm.
think that's number one, sort of identifying like how students are kind of coming into our class. I also think about students bringing in prior knowledge,
Hmm. Hmm.
and making sure that we know what that knowledge is and just how to honor it and how to build on it. Beliefs about their success and their performance,
Hmm.
and sometimes these beliefs, depending on the student, these can be very positive beliefs, or they can come from deficit thinking, and this may be something that is something that they've sort of learned or have internalized. There's just a lot of different sources, and I think it's important that as they come into the class that we sort of recognize that this is sort of part of that baggage that they're bringing in. I am a huge fan of Zaretta Hammond, and she talks about deep culture. And one of the things that I've learned about deep culture, and even just tying it into the skills that the students are bringing into the class, is also sort of that tacit knowledge, those mental models, those unconscious assumptions that they're bringing. And again, that could be tied to just their own success. That could be tied to their cultural values and sort of the role that they see, how school has played out for them, and the role that they see of school. Essentially, this is something else where I think it kind of the onus is sort of on the teachers in kind of teasing out the skills that the students bring to the class. And I think that essentially, if the class is a safe place, students will bring their whole selves, who they are. If the class is not a safe haven, then you're only going to get a shell. You're going to get an avatar, you're going to get a surrogate, so to speak. So it really depends on us as teachers on what we're doing to really create the safest environment for our students. If we're
Hmm.
creating an environment that has secret landmines, that, as Zaretta Hammond likes to put it when she talks about the amygdala and like coming into a classroom and just automatically feeling threatened, is this a classroom where we have sort of these amygdala hijacking explosives, and
Hmm.
I think that that's something that we as teachers really have to consider. And kind of going on thinking about those skills and sort of how to bring those skills out in the students and sort of making an environment where students feel safe. There's two things that I think that we can do to
Hmm.
really to sort of extrapolate these things in a safe way. Number one, as students are coming into our class, think about the visual setup of our class.
Mm-hmm.
What do they see when they come in? And that is really important. And I speak not only as a teacher, but also as a student of color
Mm-hmm.
who has gone through the educational system and gone into classes. And in one way or the other, I just don't really see, I don't see myself like represented, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And also I think on a curriculum level as well, you know, how are we designing a curriculum where students feel safe and where they are represented? I think that
Mm-hmm.
that is key.
So the language you used with the landmines, almost sort of like the unintended landmines, and I guess you never know for sure what a student is going to bring into the classroom. One thing that I personally try to stay cognizant of is what's the experience the student has had with another teacher who
Mhm.
maybe didn't have this lens. Could you speak just a little about sort of the experience that students have with prior teachers and how that might influence our current relationship with students in our classroom?
Yeah, sure. I think that you know, that the experience, I mean, I think of it sort of like as relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you think of you know, being just to kind of use an analogy, being on
Mm-hmm.
the dating scene, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and with every new connection that you make, you're always sort of bringing in that baggage from that previous relationship,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you're also sort of looking for red flags. You're looking for
Mm-hmm.
red flags and maybe even a confirmation bias, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
kind of, you are cautiously going into this new relationship and you may see something that is reminiscent of something negative that happened in the previous relationship. And that in itself can be just, that can be very isolating. It can be
Mm-hmm.
very jolting. And I think that, you know, it is really important to kind of figure out what students' past relationships have been with teachers, because we hear a lot about intention and impact, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that there are a lot of great teachers out there who have just boundless intention. Like
Mm-hmm.
they have the intention of doing right by their students, but we're also human, you know, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't want teachers to feel, you know, bad about mistakes that they've made. We're also human, but the impact is still there. You know, the impact is still there, and students are sort of going to, you know, carry those scars with them into, you know, their next with their next experience into their next classroom. And so, you know, I do think that one of the ways that we can sort of counteract that, like I personally, I like doing a lot of surveys in class, and not these big, sort of overwhelming 30 question surveys. I just like these, like five, like maybe two or three questions, you know, five at the most. And I love having open ended questions where you can get a sense of where students have been. And that can really be a guidepost for you in determining how you want to sort of steer, how you want to steer the curriculum. I can say that I've had students, you know, being a Spanish teacher and having students coming in. I teach freshmen and I also teach students in level 4. So in both of those instances, I've had students coming in from like 8th grade and they've had certain experiences. And sometimes they're like, well, I'm not good at Spanish, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason why they say they're not good at Spanish is basically because of the experience that they had maybe with a very sort of regimented, you know,
Mm-hmm.
curriculum, you know, or maybe there was a teacher who was very adamant about like grammar, let's say, because I know that's big in a world language community. And
Mm-hmm.
this was a student who just couldn't get it, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and as a result, feels really low. And so for me, what my job is, and I think that this goes, I think that for me, my approach with students in general is to be just to lavish them with encouragement,
Mm-hmm.
to lavish them with love. I mean, I am just their number one cheerleader. So from day one, regardless of the experience that they've had, I don't necessarily have to even really do like I want to do a survey with them, but I don't necessarily have to do a survey with them because I am just with my energy, you know, with the encouragement I'm giving them, I'm trying to counteract whatever deficit thinking that they have. And you will see that come across in the classroom with just little activities with them not really wanting to participate. There's always something there where maybe they think for whatever reason that they're not good enough, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's where we can step in and just tell them, no, you are, and you can do this, and I'm going to help you. You come alongside with them and you help them.
Mm-hmm. So, along this idea of taking that student experience and having it steer the curriculum, can we steer the curriculum into a conversation about assessment and sort of what does assessment look like in an equitable classroom?
That is a very tricky question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that before assessment, number one, we need to sort of take a step back and take a deep look at how we're teaching and how we're actually building intellective capacity in students, in terms of like them being able to, giving them all the conceivable skills that they need to actually complete the task. I think that for me, for example, when I think of assessment and I think of sort of building that intellective capacity, I try to design tasks kind of like along that IPA continuum, where I'm allowing students to, where I'm not kind of, where they don't end up in this sort of like backed into a corner. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think years ago when I was teaching, I remember we would do, a vocabulary test, we would do like a grammar test, and everything was just very compartmentalized, and it really didn't speak to the skills. And so now, what I like to do in terms of assessment, what I have found extremely beneficial for students and very equitable, is really just breaking it down, breaking it down into those four skill areas, right? And I think with ACTFL, they have like the interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. But breaking it down into the four skill areas where I am I am providing ample practice and ample support with writing, with speaking, with listening, and with reading. And I really think that that's key, because you have students who they may excel in, let's say you have students that may excel in the reading, students that may excel in the writing, but kind of be weak in these other areas. And I think by providing them with this full picture, you're better able to assess those strengths and those weaknesses. And then you're kind of able to take a step back, do a little bit of sort of backwards planning or back casting, and figuring out sort of that path to proficiency or that path to success.
And how does differentiation work into that? So, what does that look like in an equitable classroom? I'm thinking that like equality means differentiation for all, but help me grapple with that a little more.
Well, so I think about that visual that we have of equity versus like equality, right? So,
Mm,
like, they're not the same, like
mm-hmm,
equality is giving everyone sort of like the same thing, but that's not what everyone needs.
mm-hmm,
And I think what gets really scary for teachers, and I know that this was scary for me at one point, when we think about personalizing a curriculum and what every student needs, we automatically get overwhelmed, because we're like, oh my gosh, I have 30 kids, how can I do this? But in reality, honestly, like, if you think about sort of like the MTSS, the MTSS pyramid, and you think about tiers, like tiers of intervention, your first tier, like everything that you do in class is probably going to be suitable for 80% of your students,
mm-hmm,
right? So, whatever the lesson is, whatever the task is, and however you're designing it, that may just that's going to hit those 80% of the students. And then you're going to have like that 20% tier, and you're going to have like that 10%, and that's where you need to sort of work out those individualized sort of approaches to making sure that they have what they need. And I really think practice makes perfect.
mm-hmm,
Again, I remember when I first started reevaluating my curriculum, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I was kicking and screaming. I was like, I don't know if I can do this.
mm-hmm,
But then the more I got into it, and the more committed I became, I found that it took me less time to sort of identify what a student needs. And it can be as simple as they just need you to repeat the directions.
mm-hmm,
Maybe that student needs to work with another student, partner up, or maybe they need to work sort of individually. Maybe they need extra time. Whatever it is, you sort of you do a task analysis and you make that determination, and you help them to be successful in the
mm-hmm,
classroom.
mm-hmm. When I think of this word equity, I often have sort of conjured up in my mind the ideas of social justice.
Hmm.
And along with that is culture, the culture that students bring to the classroom. And so, in terms of having an equitable classroom focused on culturally responsive teaching, can you talk us through what that might look like and some tips to make sure that we're doing that in effective ways?
Again, I always like to defer back to Zaretta
Mhm,
Hammond.
mhm,
Okay, let me just say it's probably no surprise to your viewers. I am a really big Grey's Anatomy fan. Okay, and
mhm,
right now I'm watching Chicago PD. Yes, that's
mhm,
a shameless plug. They're really two great shows.
mhm,
And one of the things that, and let me just say, like my teacher brain is never off while I'm watching these shows, right?
mhm.
And unfortunately, I do see a correlation between trauma and teaching. Okay. And one of the things that I have noticed on both shows is that whenever they get a patient and they have no information about this patient, so think about your students coming into your classroom on the first day, you don't have any information about them. They do sort of this ABC assessment, which is airways, breathing, and circulation. And I think that that's exactly what we have to do for our students. When they come into the classroom, we have to have sort of this, develop this immediate treatment plan for them until more information becomes available.
Mhm,
And so some of the ways in which I do that, and I have like a little have a little list here, is how I sort of concoct their specific treatment plan.
mhm,
I talked about this a little bit, but I like to do, I call them dipstick surveys or assessments.
mhm,
And this, not assessments, sorry, surveys. Yeah, they're dipstick surveys. And I just kind of ask students about, what's important to them. So I know that we already have, I think one of the issues sometimes, or I think one of the problems that arise when we talk about equity and we talk about personalizing learning, teachers feel like, well, I already have the curriculum done before the kids
mhm,
come to the classroom. Like, how am I going to do all this? And, you really, I think about, don't think about reinventing the wheel, just think about integration. Okay. So like you have an idea of what you want to do with your students, but you don't know if those ideas are really going to land. You do need that information from your students to make sure that all the pieces of the puzzle fit, because you need their buy-in to their education so that you're able to better empower them, optimize and maximize their potential in your
mhm,
classroom. So that's number one. I always try to figure out like just what they're interested in and what they want to do. And I share information with them about the curriculum. I say, okay, these are some things that we're going to do, the first, like for our first unit. I just give them what they need. So think about that patient that's coming in. You're not thinking necessarily long term. You're thinking in the moment, what can I do to kind of save this person, right?
mhm,
And that's my approach with the students. I just give them the information that's readily available, what they need, and I tell them, this is what we're going to do. And I ask them, what are some things within this curriculum structure that you would want to learn? And it has been, I did that. I sort of took it up a notch during the pandemic, and I was floored. I was like, oh
mhm,
my gosh, there were a lot of things that I just hadn't considered. And so what I did was I started integrating these things for my students. Okay.
mhm,
And I took, for example, most teachers have like a warm up, some type of warm up activity. And my kids really wanted to learn. One of the things they wanted to learn was about superstitions. Okay.
mhm,
And I just found a few superstitions, looked them up, connected to our the El Mundo de Habla Hispana, so
mhm,
Latinx world,
mhm,
and I just incorporated it into the curriculum, and it was literally like a 5-10 minute thing that we did, and it was just little things like that that kind of really just honored them and made them feel that they were just really part of the curriculum,
mhm,
and that their needs, their wants, their interests were kind of centered in a way. That's one way
mhm,
to do it. I think another way, curriculum that's bursting at the seams with representation. And this is another plug here. So my friend Kia and I, we
mhm,
have a publication called Las Voces Diversas de la Diaspora.
mhm,
And the whole purpose of that is to help teachers incorporate Black and Latinx curriculum, Latinx topics into the curriculum. And so that's important. That's important that we do that. But I also go a step further and I incorporate I incorporate content highlighting Indigenous people, highlighting the LGBTQ community, and also the communities that are within my classroom.
Mhm.
And again, I know sometimes with everything that we have going on, that can sound like a lot, but it was actually quite simple. So I can give you a few examples if you like.
Absolutely. The more
um,
examples, the better.
Okay, so we did for my level one class, we did a superhero unit last this past year, and I incorporated some Black superheroes, Latinx superheroes, and I did have in my class quite a few students that were from India and that were from Pakistan, and I actually went to exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry of Chicago. So this was kind of, it just happened to like link up. They had
Mhm.
exhibit on superheroes, and I'm not a really big superhero fan, but I just really wanted to do this unit to highlight superheroes and activists. That was kind of like that was the end goal, to talk about activism and how
Mhm.
activists really are the real superheroes. And so I found Miss Marvel, who was a superhero whose family was from Pakistan, and just kind of, found some information, wrote up something real quick, and gave it to my students. And then, so that was sort of the cultural integration. And a lot of students, when I did the survey at the end of the class, they loved the fact, they were like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. And these were like all my students. These were not just my students that were from like Pakistan, or from these were from most of the students. But then I designed a mini project for them to create their own superhero. And I gave them a template. And what an amazing project, because I had kids who developed superheroes that were LGBTQ. I had heroes that were like, I remember this one student, she created a superhero, and their mission, because they had to include a mission. The mission was to fight the villain. They also had to create a villain, was to fight the villain, Dr. Jim Crow.
Mhm.
And I was floored. I was like, oh my gosh. And I think for me, the icing on the cake was a lot of the students developed superheroes. And this was kind of per my instructions too, that were from their culture. So I learned about all of these different people from all these different cultures, and they got an opportunity to present that to the class. And for me, that was culturally responsive teaching,
Mhm.
because they learned about something. I added some cultural integration, but then they took their own learning to the next level, and then they were able to share this with other students and sort of create this community of learning.
Mhm. I've heard you speak in different forums, in videos, conferences about the idea of all of this work needs to be intentional on the part of the
Yes.
teacher. And what I just heard you say, that was so intentional that that was the outcome and looking for it. And not necessarily that you went to the museum that day expecting, but then it
Yes.
became part of that. So can you talk us through the intentionality of having that equitable classroom?
Yes, and I do want to say that the whole museum experience, again, that wasn't something that I planned, because
Mhm.
I can see, I know myself, and if I were listening to this podcast, I would like, I don't have time to go to the museum, but it was just something that aligned and sort of dovetailed with what I was going to do. And so had I not gone to the museum, I probably would have still discovered who Miss Marvel
Mhm.
was.
Mhm.
And I think just being intentional is really about, again, about taking a step back, looking at your curriculum, looking at your students, and thinking about those possible connections.
Mhm.
I also think that it entails being flexible. And that's the thing. Sometimes equity isn't convenient, okay?
Mm.
And it takes time, and it really just taking that step back, looking at your students and trying to figure out, okay, how can I connect these two? How can I connect it in such a way that students are going to feel, they're going to feel represented, they're going to feel empowered. I will say that Also, just another note about being flexible. So with the survey that I did that I talked about earlier, there were some fun things on there, but then there were some other things, there were some other suggestions that I was like, "Oh my gosh, like I don't know how to incorporate this, you know?"
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to be humble.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talked to my students, I said, "Hey, these were some suggestions. Give me ideas on like how do I, how do you want to see this reflected in the curriculum?" And I think just asking those questions can be incredibly freeing because the onus is really not all on us, okay? Like students, they want to be a part of this experience. I'm not saying that they should necessarily plan the curriculum because I know I was a part of a school where that was a trend. It's like students plan the curriculum and the students were like really quick. They were like, "No, you're the teacher, you're planning the curriculum." I'm
Mm-hmm.
the student. But I do think that we can invite them to be, part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that something that I don't hear mentioned enough is that we're always learning. So just kind of reading and really expanding your own content knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not sure of, if you want to incorporate, LGBTQ themes in the curriculum, if you want to incorporate more like, Afro Latinx, people and content and traditions and things like that, you have to read, you have to do your research. You can listen to podcasts like this.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many different things that we can do to enrich ourselves, and also I want to kind of, I don't want teachers to feel like they have to sort of carry this big load on their
Mm-hmm.
shoulders by themselves. And what I normally tell people is, take it little by little, integrate, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and don't try to do it all at once. Like if you are at like ground zero, meaning that you don't do any of this at all, create a plan where every year or even like with every unit you're just making little tweaks and little adjustments so that it is sustainable for you as well
Mm-hmm.
and for the students, and it comes off as authentic and not
Mm-hmm.
you really just checking your boxes.
Right. So you had mentioned earlier about having your humble moment with students and your advice to teachers about, taking the small steps to get there, try the little things out. Part of that process, that humility, is recognizing our own biases that we have as teachers, right? And
Yes.
um, that that is often a very humble moment that is required. And so, can you talk us through this idea of teachers having these biases and what's our responsibility in recognizing them?
Yes, we all have our biases. And as I think about this question, I'm kind of reminded of experience that I had a long time ago when I was a middle school teacher. I routinely sort of analyzed my grades, and at the time I noticed that a lot of the male students in my class, a lot of the boys, that their grades were slightly lower than the girls on just across all categories. And looking at that, I had to ask myself, I was like, okay, is this a coincidence? Is this, does this have to do with like how I'm teaching, And then at the time, and I think this, again, this probably was a coincidence. I came across an article that talked about, I think it was, okay, this is kind of weird, but the article was actually about the feminization of church.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of applied it because my teacher brain is always going off. And I
Mm-hmm.
just thought about, what if it's my style of teaching that's just really not connected to, I'm not connecting to this, to the male students in my class.
Mm-hmm.
What if there was something inherently, different about my approach, And so I had to really sit on that. I had to sit on that and I had to start sort of having this almost this sort of like self-examination, like this outer body experience while I'm teaching and while I'm grading. And I did change up my teaching style and I became a little bit more flexible because I think that, you know, as a female teacher, I kind of gravitated towards sort of like, back then,
Mm-hmm.
like the female learning style or, like doing things that were kind of writing in the class and kind of like not putting emphasis on, high energy activities like games and, and things like that. And I was able to recognize that. And I noticed another trend in my school that we had this detention table. And and I was sort of in charge of the detention table. So I wasn't the teacher assigning students, but I was the one who managed them. And guess who were always at the detention table? The
Hmm.
boys. And the black and brown students were disproportionately
Mhm.
represented at that table, and again, I took a step back. I talked to the principal, I talked to the teachers, and really tried to help them see, like, this really is a problem. Like, you can't tell me that, that these are the only kids in class that are causing problems,
Mhm.
and so I think that being open, number one,
Mhm.
being open and being honest with ourselves, like really looking at the data and letting the data really tell a story. So you're looking at your grades, you're looking at, like, who are the parents that I'm calling all the time, like, look at those trends and just be open to the story, to the narrative that it's telling. And then also having moments of self-examination, like recognizing your biases, but also taking action, like in the way that I did. I think that that will be, extremely beneficial. And I also think the good news is I was reading another article having to do with, there was a correlation between teachers who routinely examine their practices and them being more and sort of bearing characteristics more aligned to like an anti-racist educator.
Mhm.
So that gave me hope too, in terms of the more that you read, the more that you seek out, you're becoming aware of these issues and you're
Mhm.
able to take action versus just not really, having that self-reflective, that taking that introspective look, at what you're doing.
Mhm. It seems that when you're out and about in your life, you're finding inspiration for what to do with your students. And talking about intentionality rather than finding those spark moments, where are you looking in terms of finding your inspiration as an educator? Conferences, individuals? What can you recommend to us?
So I think I've been talking about this book here, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. And actually, just going back to your last question, there are a few things that Hammond recommends as well, and that is begin with intention, recognize your cultural frames and your reference points, and just the continual examination. So I love reading anything that she produces, because I feel like she is the end all, the be all when it comes to like
Mhm.
culturally responsive teaching. And I also think so. So there are a few people. I had an opportunity to attend a few sessions over the summer. John Bracy, I really appreciate his webinar just about adding color, to the curriculum. And again, he emphasized just being intentional.
Mhm.
He talked about how, he had to really sort of like scour the Latin Roman world to find examples of, people of color doing great things. And I was just really impacted by that, because we have Latin at my school, and our old Latin teacher, she just left and she went to another school, but she was phenomenal, and I was just amazed at all of these great resources that she brought into the class. A lot of CI readers,
Mhm.
in Latin, highlighting, the role of people of African descent.
Mhm.
So I think John Bracy definitely is one person. Benjamin Tinsley, I don't know if you
Mhm.
are familiar with Ben, but he this past summer he did a presentation with CI Reboot, and he's a French teacher, and he talks about, incorporating Afro Franco content into the class.
Mhm.
So Kia and I, we do sort of the Black Afro Latinx, and he does, the French. So I think
Mhm.
that those are two people who I really, look up to, and I see that they are, in the trenches,
Mhm.
and they really are, helping teachers to make those connections. And I think, if yeah, I mean, there's probably so many. There's
Right.
probably so
We
many
can't
that I'm
mention
just
them all, right? And it's sort of, and as soon as you start saying one name, you're like, oh, but if I don't say someone,
right.
it's always kind of the fear in there. Yeah. But rest assured that the one you forgot has been mentioned by
Right.
somebody else, so it'll all get
Yes.
covered at some point. So at this point in our conversation, I want to move the teacher curtain back a little bit, and we're gonna get to know AC the person a little
Oh
more.
boy.
Not, I hate to say just the teacher, because we so define ourselves as teachers and educators, but just to get to know you a little more. So either or questions. Choose one. You can maybe say why, but not totally
Okay.
necessary. So the first one, okay? First one here. There's a party happening. Would you be the one that planned it, or do you just want to attend?
Ooh, attend.
You just want to go and have fun.
Yes.
Logistics of planning, not your
No.
thing. Not in that realm, anyway. Okay, another one. Patterns or solid colors?
Oh, well, hmm. Okay,
Hmm.
I'm looking at what I have on today. I'm going to say patterns.
Okay. You tend to gravitate towards patterns
Yes.
a little more. Okay. And the last one here. Are you going to play on the team or are you better off coaching?
Okay, I can't do both, right?
Try to
I'm a
try to
backseat
choose one.
driver. Okay, let's see. Wow. Okay. I'm going to go with, I'm going to go with coaching.
Okay. All right. Awesome. That's good. That's good, right? So you're attending the party with some patterns on and just coming from some sort of game that you coached. So it's that's why you had no time to plan the party.
Yes,
So
you hit the
good.
nail right on the head.
See, now we know everything there is to know about AC the person. So I am absolutely certain that there are listeners out there that would really enjoy connecting with you to go deeper on some of these topics. What's the best way to reach out to you?
Okay, so I am kind of everywhere. Okay, but you said the
Mm-hmm.
best way, right? Okay, so the best way would be my Instagram is AC Quintero. My Twitter is Clase Castellano. So let me just say the elephant in the room is that I started these accounts all at different times. So that's why I didn't have that vision. I didn't have that cohesive, unifying vision at the time. And now I'm like, okay, I have all these different names. But it's so apropos to my personality because I am kind of like that. On Facebook, I do have a Facebook group
Mm-hmm.
dedicated to teaching practices. It is Teaching from the Trenches. So
Mm-hmm.
AC Quintero, Teaching from the Trenches. And then if you're interested in checking out any of my novels, I have a website which you can just Google Novels and Resources by AC Quintero. Have lots of great CI novels, diverse topics for students. And also my TPT store. I do a
Mm-hmm.
lot of short stories. Uh, and they are, I always say they are the same quality as my novels, except for they're just ebooks. And that is Teaching Spanish Made Easy.
Okay. So many awesome ways to connect with you. So, as we finish out our conversation, before we say goodbye, is there one really actionable piece of advice that you can leave with us about equity in the classroom?
Yes, I would kind of sum it up in being humble and being flexible.
Excellent. Humble and flexible. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today to help us navigate how to make our classrooms more equitable and make students feel recognized and centered and important, I guess is a good way to sort of end on that. So, thank you for your time and this has been wonderful.
Thank you, and have a great day.
There was certainly a lot to take in from that conversation with AC Quintero. Try to figure out what a couple of those actionable takeaways are for you that you can bring into your classroom to make it a more equitable space for your students. I know for me personally, a big takeaway was that need to be humble and to look at my own biases, to examine them as the starting point for even trying to provide my students with an equitable classroom experience. Be sure to check out the show notes so that you can connect with AC Quintero. You'll also see a link in there to sign up for Talking Points, which is my weekly newsletter with tips on language teaching and also a reminder when each new episode comes out so you do not miss it on the podcast. I will talk to you real soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.